Well, it's time for another video, and in this tutorial we're going to cover a different type of mold making process. It's going to be a brush-on mold, but a brush-on mold for a very specific reason. So in this instance, this is one of those weird things. This is a decorative tile from my mother-in-law. This is an antique piece, almost feels like hydrostone, but I just thought this was a really cool piece, and this is the kind of thing you would typically encounter. A lot of our customers that do restoration work encounter this sort of thing where it might be mounted on a wall, or there might be some crown molding or something like that that needs to be reproduced, and that might have to be molded in place. So something that normally would present itself as a very simple poured block mold might be more complicated because it might be mounted to a wall. So in this instance, we're going to show how to do a brush-on mold of something like this. And this is for two purposes. And these are two important considerations. Is one, in the restoration world, when you have to mold something in place where you can't move it, again, crown molding, or say some kind of commemorative plaque that might need to be molded before other work is done. One application of this in the construction world is when an older building is being extended, or there's a new addition being added onto, and the stonework of that part of the building needs to match the original stonework. So in cases like that, sometimes you have to go out and mold some of those key stone elements off that old architecture so they can be reproduced on the new part of the building. So there's that. And then there's also the cost-saving part of this. In this instance, I just want to make a couple of these just in case this particular one breaks. I'd like to have a backup of this, and I just think this would be a cool piece in a different material, like cold cast copper, for instance. So because I want to keep the cost on this down, rather than make a big chunky block mold over this whole thing, I'm going to make a brush-on mold. So that's the other thing, is there are pieces like this, these larger plaques, that may not be practical to mold in a big block mold, mainly for cost reasons. So in that instance, that's where a brush-on mold is really handy. So we're going to do that today. We're going to make a relatively fast brush-on mold. And again, the reason for the speed is those of you doing restoration work, if you're doing a mold inside of a building where you have to be in and out in a relatively short fashion, is really important to be able to crunch that process down, make everything as efficient as possible. So let's get started. We're going to start with material selection. Now, because this is, in this instance, we're going to be molding something that ultimately I want to cast resin into the finished mold. I want to use a silicone for that because I want to avoid a lot of release agents that would have to be cleaned and degreased. But more importantly, for the restoration side of things, I want to use a material that has the least adhesive potential for sticking to that internal piece. So that's where we're going to use silicone, and we're also going to use tin cure silicone. Now, the reason for tin cure silicone on this, other than say a platinum, one of our platinum formulas, is tin cure silicone is much more forgiving where cure inhibition is concerned. So many of you who've come into our store with this sort of situation, this is typically what I recommend, and this is why. When you're molding something that's out of your care, that's in somebody else's shop, that you don't know what has come in contact with that, real important to treat it as though it is contaminated. And even under those circumstances, still with tin cure, this is a very difficult tin cure to screw up. But that said, I always recommend mixing up a small test batch and putting it on a part of the piece just to test to make sure there's not some other crazy thing that you haven't accounted for. Also to test your release potential. So in this instance, we're just going to use some of the super release PTR to release this. But if this was a restoration job, you could still use this provided you make allowances for how to remove it. A lot of times, restoration work like that, I recommend people put down a layer of clear PVA first before anything else, before any release or silicone. And the reason for that is clear PVA is water soluble. So once you're done with your mold, that's easy to wash off the finished part and return everything as close to normal as possible. But again, I cannot stress this enough. If you're doing restoration work, that is your responsibility to get in there and test and make sure everything in your process is all compatible and nothing's going to stain that original plaster or anything like that. So again, when in doubt, run a test to make sure. That might slow things down, but trust me, you will thank me for that later. Now, to the silicone. This super release, we've covered this in a lot of videos. This is just a general purpose release agent for silicones, especially silicone to silicone. So with this silicone, we offer two different catalysts. We have a fast catalyst and a medium catalyst. Now for this particular project, we're going to use the fast catalyst because again, we want to make sure everything moves along as fast as possible. But an important consideration, anytime you're using the fast catalyst, be aware that a fast catalyst will shorten the lifespan of the mold. Not with this formula, it's not going to be as drastic as some of the others out there, but that does happen. So you want to be aware of that does eat away at that lifespan of the mold. Now, last but not least, because this is a pourable silicone, we need to change this to a brushable consistency. Again, we're going to be working potentially on the side of a building or something like that. So anytime we have that going on, we're going to add the Thixo, the thixotropic additive. And what this does is converts our silicone from a Newtonian flow liquid, pourable liquid, to a thixotropic paste, think like peanut butter. So rather than have a mold that you could pour and self-level like this, we're going to have something that you could brush and or trowel onto the piece. So real important, if you don't get this, you're going to be chasing this rubber all over the side of whatever you're putting it on. And again, in restoration work, you got to have that Thixo so you don't wind up with an expensive puddle and just a thin little membrane of silicone on your part. So one last step is our mother mold. For this, we're going to use a plaster bandage mother mold because again, we want to keep this quick, relatively inexpensive, and relatively lightweight. We want to keep this whole process relatively simple because again, imagine we're working on the side of the inside of a building. We don't want to be dragging in a lot of exotic materials and trying to use them way up in the air. Plaster bandages are fantastic for this kind of work. So now let's move on to the mounting stage. Okay, now what I've done here is we're starting with a piece of foam core board, and normally I could just mount this flat. Now again, if this is on a wall, then obviously this is an unnecessary step. But what we're doing is I've made a little allowance for this hanging hardware. So this can sit down a little bit lower and allow this to be flush with the board. Now, if you are molding something in place on a wall or an existing plaque or something like that that's already mounted on a wall, you want to find a way that you can mold this. If you have to put some cardstock or something like that around to give it a nice margin, you want to find a way that you can make your mold so it doesn't just dead end right at the edge of the piece, that it hits and then goes out at a right angle. That way you have a nice flange on your mold, and that helps the mold align better later on. Now what we're doing here is we're just going to hot glue this in place. And there we have it. Quick mounting. Now again, because we're going to try to simulate the circumstances of molding this in place, normally I'd put some clay around the edge. Now you could do that, but remember, whatever you do, if you're molding something in place in someone's house or a building or something like that, don't do anything to the piece that you're not prepared to undo. So if you're putting clay around, I would do that after you put on something like clear PVA, because that way it's much easier to remove that clay residue. Now we're ready to spray our release on, and remember that the release agent mainly helps everything come out of the mold a lot cleaner and keep it from sticking to any of these surfaces like this. Sometimes you can have silicone kind of soak into some of that foam core board and grab it a little bit better. So real important, always release your pattern as well as the area around your pattern. But here's the most important consideration when you're using a release like this, is there's always that weird instance where there's something on your pattern or the surrounding area or something that likes the silicone and wants to bond to it. So when you don't know for sure what you're dealing with, always a good idea to make sure everything is properly released. Now remember, it's always a good idea to make sure you get everything released and sealed and everything ready for mold making well before you're mixing up your material. Because if your release agent needs to dry or outgas, you want to make sure it does that before you start applying silicone. If you don't wait, you're going to wind up with little pinhole bubbles all over the inside of your mold. So give it plenty of time to dry, usually about 20 or 30 minutes. Now we're ready to measure out our silicone. And one of the first things we also need to do is we're going to pour up some mold keys. You might have seen these used in some of our previous videos. These are just some little blisters that we can pour our extra silicone into. And on our final coat, this is only going to take 2 or 3 coats of silicone to make this mold. So what I'm going to do is pour these first, and then that way on the final coat we can pop these out and embed these around the edge of our silicone mold and help those register into the mother mold. Now we got to move fast because of course this is the fast catalyst, so we want to make sure we have everything ready to go. Real important, this is a weight ratio. This is 100 parts of the base to 10 parts of the catalyst by weight, and that does not translate to a volume formula. So you want to make sure if you're working with any of these TinCure formulas like this, make sure you have an accurate gram scale. These are fairly forgiving formulas, but the catalyst is not cheap, so you don't want to just eyeball that. And if you over-catalyze your rubber, it will degrade faster. So real important to be aware of that. Now we just need a small batch of silicone. I'm going to make up enough that I can pour some keys and then brush some over our part. So I'm just going to mix up 300 grams of base rubber to be accompanied by 30 grams of the catalyst. And you'll notice I also have my stir stick and my disposable brush on hand too. So, and of course our thick sew. Ready to get this mixed and poured into our key form. Like I said, we'll use the rest, we'll add some thick sew to it, and that's going to become our first layer of our mold. But again, move fast, and remember with TinCure silicones, heat will accelerate, but more importantly, humidity. Humidity is the main catalyst for this, so be aware of that and move fast. If you are in Houston, be aware that that may speed it up a lot. I don't need a whole lot of these, just enough to go right around that margin. Keys are one of those things that you can't really have these sitting around for too long or they lose their ability to bond to the fresh silicone. So make enough for the mold with a few extra, but I've learned the hard way that keeping a bucket of keys on hand does not make as much sense as it seems like it would. Now we're going to add some of our thick sew. And I'm just adding maybe a gram, so not even 1%. Again, because time is of the essence here, I'm just going to dump this out and we're going to work it on the piece. This is a relatively humid day here in West Texas, so I don't want to take any chances. And because this is a hard pattern, I can really scrub that silicone into that pattern surface. This is one of those reasons why you want to mix up a small test batch first and see what the set time is where you are located. Because again, if you are in a hot, humid environment, your working time is going to go by fast. And if you are in a cool, arid climate, it's going to be much slower. So take all those things into consideration. And if you're doing restoration work, those are all things you want to be able to share with your client and be able to say, hey, this mold is going to take a little bit longer because of the weather today. Now see how I'm coming out there on the edge to make that flange? Real important, because I want to have that, I want to have enough area to put those keys and have a good positive registration into that mother mold later on. And I'm doing this in a relatively fast fashion here. But if you are new to this, I don't recommend that you just jump right in and use 100% of the fast catalyst. If you do that, it might shock you with the speed with which it sets. So always a good idea to, again, run a test first, do a smaller mold to make sure you have acquainted yourself with the materials and know how they will behave, because that's probably one of the main mistakes I see people making starting out, is they jump right into a material without having ever used it before, and they use it for some real critical process like a head cast or heaven forbid, like a restoration project or something, and they don't take time to learn the material. So then they have a lot of surprises when they don't really have the patience to have surprises. Now, another thing to remember with a restoration mold like this, it's a lot like life casting, because there's always going to be areas when, again, if you're working on a vertical surface, doing the best job you possibly can, there is a high probability that you're going to have some air entrapment if you're putting thickened silicone up on a vertical surface. So be aware of that, do the best job you can, but remember that in restoration work, a lot of this is more of a transitional thing to get this off of the building and onto your workbench where you can make a more professional, better quality production mold. So that's okay to have some air bubbles and things like that, because you can always rework that pattern in the privacy of your shop. You still want to get as good of a mold as possible, but you just know you're always going to be making some concessions in quality for the sake of time and, of course, being able to do this on a vertical surface. So this is about to set up, so I'm going to let this kick the rest of the way, and then we're going to let that set up enough to where we can come back with, we're just going to do 2 coats on this. Okay, our first layer has set up. And again, the test for how you want to check that is find a spot on the edge of your board, the edge of your piece you're working on. When you tap that with your fingernail and none comes off, that's a good sign that you can proceed with your next layer of silicone. We're going to mix up a larger batch for this because I'm going to shoot for finishing this in 2 layers. So that first layer should capture all of our detail, and then the second layer will just build up the bulk of the mold. So this one we're going to measure out 600 grams. So we're doubling that previous batch size. Now, I always like to mix up my silicone before my catalyst and my base rubber before I add my Thixo. And the reason for that is once you add that Thixo in, it gets a little bit more difficult to stir because you've changed that to a thixotropic mixture that's, again, like peanut butter. So at this point, we're still at a flowing liquid state, so it does make that a lot easier to mix. And then I add my Thixo. One extra little bit of housekeeping we can do here, if you want to make sure you can positively ID this second layer, if you are concerned about coverage, you can always add a little bit of silicone pigment. So the silicone pigment added, just when that's dispersed, that's going to give us more of a light purple kind of color, and that just helps us identify where we have and have not applied our silicone. So I always like to, when I'm making brush-on molds, especially when I'm working with other folks, always like to put a little bit of pigment in there just so we can all track our progress and see where we've been. And also, just when you're working on slick silicone, it's hard to always tell where you've applied fresh silicone. Now, the other thing we want to have on hand is our keys. So we've got these little blister keys ready to demold. Again, I'm just going to go ahead and pour it right out of my mixing cup here. And obviously, if we're working on a vertical surface, then we're just going to work out of our mixing cup. But just for time's sake, because I want to, again, minimize how much time I'm spending going back and forth between my mixing cup and my mold surface, I'm just going to get all of that out and on to the mold surface. And one thing you want to watch for on a mold like this, because we are going to build a mother mold. Now, this is going to be a pretty shallow mold overall, so not a big issue with undercuts, but because we are dealing with a right angle here where the pattern meets the work surface, you want to be aware of that, and if you can, bevel that a little bit so that your mold does not lock. You don't want to create a lock there between your shell and that edge. So if it's at a perfect 45-degree angle there, or 90-degree angle where it meets the board over the part, if it comes back in a little bit, there's a drip of silicone, your shell might want to lock on. So be aware of that and try to bevel that as much as possible so you don't wind up with areas around the edge where your shell wants to lock on. And our goal is about a thickness of about a 1/4 inch to 3/8 inch on average. Just remember, there's nothing wrong with going thicker than that, and if we go thinner than that in a few places, that's okay too, but we want to be there on average just so we have a good strong mold, and we don't want to go too far over that just because that's a lot of wasted money when we start making really thick brush-on molds. So a 1/2 inch is about as thick as you ever need to make a brush-on mold unless it's a thick undercut area. Remember, when you're making a brush-on mold and you've got to make a shell over the top of that, you want to make this outside surface as smooth as possible, because if you've got a lot of little undulations and a lot of like little peaks like frosting or meringue, what happens is those are points where the mold could misalign later on. So keep that outside as smooth as you can get it. So we are now ready. Once we've applied our silicone all over our parts, we have a nice even layer of silicone. We're now ready to demold our keys. So these little blister keys, as long as they're fresh, they bond really well to new silicone. Just be careful, you notice I'm wearing gloves here, be careful not to touch the surface too much and transfer oils so that you get a good bond between these keys, which are partially set, and that new silicone. And I always like to put my key slightly different on each side, just so I don't have to worry about wondering how the mold lines up later on. So I like it to be distinctly different, since this is a rectangle shape and I don't want somebody to try to put the mother mold on the wrong direction. I want to make sure that is immediately clear which side is which. So there we go. There is our finished silicone application. And now ready to step back and let that cure so we can put our mother mold on. Okay, our silicone mold is now set, so we are now ready to proceed with our mother mold. For the mother mold, we're going to be using plaster bandages. Now, I've covered this in a lot of other tutorials, but those of you who are new to the channel or just want to see how it's applied to this sort of thing, I'm going to go ahead and do it again. So what I like to do with plaster bandages, and it's real important to remember, these are medical grade, these are the high grade plaster bandages. These are not like hobby store plaster bandages for crafts and that sort of thing. So big quality difference in that. And most importantly, the set time. And these are not more expensive. They're just a little bit harder to get. They don't sell these because they are considered a medical product. They're not something you're going to find at a hobby store. But they're reasonably priced, and they cure much, much faster. So what I like to do is layer these about 3 layers thick, sometimes 4 if I need that extra strength. And you can either tear these or cut these, but cutting results in a lot less dust. So we're going to do that today. And typically something like this size is going to use about 2 rolls of bandage material. Now, it's real important whenever you're working with plaster bandages, remember that water is the catalyst. So you want clean water, good quality water. If you live in the country with well water that has high mineral content, sometimes that can act as an accelerator, but just be aware the quality of your water can impact the end result with your bandages. Now, I'm just using cool water here. When we use this for life casting, a lot of times we'll use warm water, but here we just want this to be just room temperature. And you want to take time to push that into the surface of the silicone so you don't have any little air bubbles or voids, because remember, all this is going to seep back together, and if you have any gaps, that can lead to distortions in that mold. Now you'll notice I'm placing the bandages about halfway over the preceding bandage. And that way, overall, we have an average thickness of about 6 layers thick. And that gives us a nice, strong mother mold. And again, if you're doing something bigger than this, then you might want to think about doing more layers or a thicker mold, or doing adding struts to this, adding braces out of scraps of wood. Now when I get over to this edge, I want to take care to fold that edge back wherever I have that right up against. You'll see anytime we have these bandages going right to the edge, what I like to do is take that bandage material, fold that lengthwise, and what that does is just gives us a much stronger, more secure edge there. And then make sure you take care to seat those onto those keys. And that way you just get really good registration later on. Now we could also use hydrocal for a mother mold here. Hydrocal and burlap or hydrocal and hemp is a great mother mold also. The main reason we're going with plaster bandages for this is those of you doing restoration work, you really don't want to drag all that other stuff into someone else's house or some kind of other building where that could create more of a mess than is necessary. So plaster bandages are somewhat self-contained, so it just makes them a lot easier to work with on this sort of situation. Technically I'm done, but I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit more to the back here just to give it a little bit more strength. And this is going to be a pretty simple mold without much of a span here. But if I was doing a much larger piece, I would highly recommend putting some braces in here, some 1x1s or some wooden dowels built into it, just to give it that extra support so it stays true and straight across that large span. Now the other thing that you want to be mindful of that's not really important on something this size, but remember all this is going to be flipped over for casting. So if necessary, this is going to flip over fairly easy and be a pretty straightforward mold. And if it's not level, we can put some little balls of clay underneath it to stabilize it. But when you're working on a larger piece and that becomes an issue, sometimes it's handy to go ahead and build some legs into the mold. And you might have seen that done in some of our other tutorials. So in the video description, of course, we always put all of the products we use in the video description, but as well as that, be sure to check out, I'll put a link to our brush on mold page, because you'll see a variety of different mother molds done different ways. And mother molds are one of those things that are very much built to the purpose of the mold. So that's one of those things that, again, to be a good mold maker, you want to file away a lot of different methods and be ready to adapt to whatever the situation calls for. My hands got plaster on them, so I need to clean them off. That's where we use the remainder of our plaster water. And now we're ready to let this set up. Now, on something like this, these bandages set up pretty fast, but we can have a good, strong mother mold. In about 30 minutes, this will be hard enough, strong enough, we could easily demold it. If you're working in an area where, some kind of restoration piece, you want to make sure you let this set up to full hardness before you start prying on it and removing it. Because the last thing you want to do is pull this off while it's green and warp an otherwise perfect mold. All right, it is now time to demold our freshly made silicone mold with mother mold. And here is our mother mold, and we're just going to set that right down here. And now carefully peel back our silicone mold. Now, it's important to note that we have just a little bit of plaster residue here from me flipping this over on the table. But other than that, our piece just really minor cleanup, and we're right back to where we started. And that is of utmost importance when you're molding someone else's property like that. Now, last little bit of cleanup, we're just going to go around and trim off some of the excess silicone just to pretty up our mold here. Okay, here is our finished mold ready for casting. So because this is a silicone mold, we can go right into this with a variety of different polyurethane resins, and which we will do in the next video. So stay tuned for that. But most importantly, because this is a silicone mold and had minimal impact on our original pattern, that means that this pattern is very easy to clean up. Now, had we applied a layer of clear PVA to this, it would be very easy to clean this up with warm water and return it exactly as it was before. Now, I can't stress enough, in closing, really important, anytime you're doing a project like this where you're going to be making a mold off of someone else's wall or someone else's artifact or whatever, make sure you test everything that you're going to be using in that process against a similar surface, or if at all possible, an insignificant part of the surface you're going to be working with, because there's always going to be some little surprise, and obviously you don't want that to happen in front of your client. So the more of that you can test and understand all of those variables before you start making an expensive mold, the better off you will be. So there you have the process of making a brush-on silicone mold in order to either conserve silicone or to be able to make a mold in place for restoration work. So, of course, as usual, all of the products we used in this video are available on our website. So I'll put links to all of the products in the video description, as well as I mentioned earlier, I'll put a link to the video library page that we have that just focuses on brush-on molds, because in that section, we show a variety of different brush-on mold techniques, as well as, most importantly, a lot of different mother mold techniques. So those of you embarking on this kind of project, again, you want to have that mental arsenal of a lot of different techniques, a lot of different mold techniques and mother mold techniques at your disposal for that. So there you go. If you haven't already, be sure to like and subscribe, and thanks again for watching.